What's going on, guys? Today in World of Warships, we're going to be taking a look at this ship right here, the Aurora. She's the Russian Tier 3 protected cruiser, and I'm going to be discussing why she may or may not be a floating dog turd, depending on your preference of ship. For this video, I'm going to be comparing her to her counterpart and most commonly compared to ship, the American Tier 3 cruiser. It's from the pre-Dreadnought era, according to the description. Pre-World War I, the St. Louis. And you can see on the outside, she looks very similar to the Aurora as far as appearance and layout goes, and that is because they are a very similar design of ship. So to start off, we'll take a look at her armor. She has 70 millimeters of armor on her deck, which isn't too bad. The St. Louis, however, has armor 76 millimeters of armor. She has 6 to 9 millimeters of armor, depending her citadel, which is absolutely pathetic. The St. Louis, by comparison, 13 to 102 millimeters. So you're not going to be as durable in this ship as you are in the St. Louis. The St. Louis is very notable for being able to punch above its tier and hold its own against Tier 4, if not some Tier 5 ships. You're not going to be able to do that in the Aurora, which is this really big downfall. Guns, however, are comparable to the St. Louis. She has 14 102 50mm guns, the same as the St. Louis. Her range is a little bit better, and she has that very notable Russian firing arc for her guns. Her guns have a very high arc on them, allowing you to punch down through decks and ships. 11.2 kilometers is the range of the guns on this ship. The St. Louis, fully upgraded, you only get about 9.5 kilometers out of them. With a slightly slower reload rate of 8.6 seconds compared to the St. Louis's 8.0, it's questionable whether or not her guns are actually better than the St. Louis, giving you that little bit of range but a slightly slower reload for about comparable damage. 2,100 damage is the max you'll do with your high explosive. 2,700 is the max you'll do with your AP. And the St. Louis, you'll be able to deal out 3,000 damage with your AP. So a little bit punchier guns with the St. Louis. Flatter trajectory, slightly smaller range, faster reload, and same dispersion, 99 kilometers, or 99 meters, Jesus, 99 kilometers, that's a bit of a big dispersion. 99 meters is the dispersion radius for the guns on this ship, so they are fairly accurate, but it is a Tier 3 ship. And yeah, so you get that high firing arc, but you lose out on the flatter trajectory and a little bit more punching power from the St. Louis. So it's hard to describe whether or not if this ship is a better ship than the St. Louis. I'm definitely saying no, but it all depends on your preference. Speed, 19 knots. St. Louis gets 22 knots out of her, and the same rudder shift time, 6.4 seconds for the rudder for both ships. So what is the point in buying this ship then? It's $12, I believe, on the premium store right now. Why would you want a floating dog turd such as this? Well, let's look at the tech tree, and this is my main selling point for this ship. You have two choices. You have your Diana for 1,650 gold, or you have your Aurora, which I'm not sure how much gold it was now because I bought the damn thing. But to me, buying a Tier 2 premium cruiser is pretty much pointless because you're only going to be in Tier 2 for about 2 to 3 games. Having a Tier 3 cruiser will give you a little bit more longevity out of it, and it'll allow you to train up a captain in time to throw in your Kirov or your Budiani, whatever. I don't know how the hell you say that. And if you got buddies all playing the game at the same time, around the same tier, having a nice little money earner down at Tier 3 is nice to kind of play with friends who might be starting out the game and you don't have any more Tier 3s, which is pretty much the exact reason why I bought this ship. I have a couple friends starting out, and I needed some Tier 3 ships, and I've always been curious about the Aurora, so I wanted to give it a shot. So that's all the paper stats. Let's go ahead and look at gameplay and see how well she performs out on the high seas. The Aurora was one of 3 Pallada-class cruisers built around 1900 for service in the Pacific against the Japanese. Russia was currently fighting a war against them, and they weren't very well known for their navy. All 3 ships of this class served during the Russo-Japanese War. The Aurora survived the Battle of Tsushima and was interred under U.S. protection in the Philippines, and she was eventually returned to the Russians. The second ship, the Pallada, was sunk by the Japanese at Port Arthur in 1904. The third ship, the Diana, was interred in Saigon after the Battle of the Yellow Sea. Soon after her completion in November of 1903, the Aurora received orders to sail with a group of reinforcements to the Russian Pacific Fleet. However, she suffered from repeated mechanical failures and had to be repaired at several ports along the way. When word was received of the start of the Russo-Japanese War, she was detached from the reinforcement fleet and sent back to the Baltic. After refitting, the Aurora was ordered back to Asia as part of the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, a collection formed from the Russian Baltic Fleet. On the way to the Far East, the Aurora sustained light damage during confused friendly fire, which killed the ship's chaplain and a sailor during the Dogger Bank incident. What is a Dogger Bank incident, you may ask? Well, I'll be glad to tell you. Like I previously stated, Russia wasn't very well known for having a capable navy around this particular point in history. The warships involved in this incident were en route to the Far East to reinforce the Pacific Squadron stationed at Port Arthur and then later Vladivostok during the Russo-Japanese War. The fleet allegedly, and keep in mind, allegedly, sighted balloons and 4 enemy cruisers the day previously. Coupled with the possibility that Japanese might have somehow sent ships around the world to attack them, the Russian admiral called for increased vigilance, issuing an order that no vessel of any sort must be allowed to get in among the fleet, and to prepare to open fire on any vessel failing to identify themselves. With ample reports about the presence of Japanese torpedo boats, submarines, and minefields in the North Sea, and the general nervousness of the Russian sailors, 48 harmless fishing vessels were attacked by the Russians thousands of miles away from enemy waters. After negotiating a non-existent minefield, the Russian fleet sailed into the North Sea. The disaster began in the evening when the captain of the supply ship Kamchatka, which was the last ship in the Russian convoy, took a passing Swedish ship for a Japanese torpedo boat and radioed that he was being attacked. Later that night, during the fog, the officers on duty sighted British trawlers, which are fishing ships. He interpreted their signals incorrectly and classified them as Japanese torpedo boats, despite being more than 20,000 miles away from Japan. The Russian warships illuminated the trawlers with their searchlights and opened fire. The British crawler, the Crane, was sunk and its captain and first mate were killed. 4 other trawlers were damaged and 6 other fishermen were wounded, one of whom died a few months later. As the trawlers had their nets down, they were unable to flee, and in the general chaos that ensued, Russian ships shot at each other, and the cruisers Aurora and the Dmitry Donsky were taken for Japanese warships and bombarded by 7 battleships sailing in formation, damaging both ships and killing the chaplain of the Aurora and at least one other sailor, and severely wounding another. During the pandemonium, several Russian ships signaled that torpedoes had hit them, and on board the battleship Borodino, rumors spread that the ship was being boarded by Japanese, with some crews donning life vests and lying prone on the deck, and others drawing cutlasses, because, they were still using cutlasses around this particular point in time. More serious losses to both sides were only avoided by the extremely low quality of the Russian gunnery, with the battleship Aurora reportedly firing more than 500 shells without hitting a single fucking thing. After 20 minutes of firing, the fishermen reported that they saw a blue light on one of the warships, which was the order to cease firing. Holy shit, the Royal Navy prepared for war, with 28 battleships of the home fleet being ordered to raise steam and prepare for action, while the British cruiser squadrons shadowed the Russian fleet as it made its way through the Bay of Biscay and down the coast of Portugal. Under diplomatic pressure, the Russian government agreed to investigate the incident. The admiral of the fleet was ordered to dock in Vigo, Spain, where he left behind those officers considered responsible, as well as at least one officer who had been critical to him. From Vigo, the main Russian fleet then approached Tangiers, and then on to Morocco, and then lost contact with the Kamchatka for several days. The Kamchatka eventually rejoined the fleet and claimed that she had engaged 3 Japanese warships and fired over 300 shells. The ships she had actually fired at were Swedish merchantmen, a German trawler, and a French schooner. As the fleet left Tangiers, one ship accidentally severed the city's underwater telegraph cable and prevented the city from communicating with Europe for 4 days. The Russian fleet was barred from using the Suez Canal and British ports as a result of the incident. It thus proceeded around Africa, where it rendezvoused with German supply ships that had been hired to replenish its coal stocks while at sea. After that, they would sail on to the Sea of Japan, where they would be soundly defeated by the Japanese Navy during the Battle of Tsushima. Would you like to hear about the Battle of the Tsushima Strait? It's a good story, and hey, we got plenty of time. Because of the 18,000-mile journey, the Russian fleet was in relatively poor condition for the battle. Additionally, there were significant deficiencies in the Russian Navy's fleet equipment and training, as previously mentioned. Russian naval tests with their torpedoes exposed major technical failings in their ships' designs. Admiral Togo of the Japanese Navy's greatest advantage was that of his experience, being the only active admiral in any navy at that time with combat experience aboard battleships. Because of the Russians' desire to slip into the port of Vladivostok undetected, they approached Japanese waters outside of regular shipping channels to reduce the chance of their detection. On the night of the 26th to the 27th of May 1905, the Russian fleet approached the Tsushima Strait. In the night, thick fog blackened the straits, giving the Russians an advantage. At 2:45 in the morning, Japanese Standard Time, the Japanese auxiliary cruiser Shiano Maru observed 3 lights on what appeared to be a vessel on the distant horizon and closed to investigate. These lights were from the Russian hospital ship, the Aurora, which, in compliance with the rules of war, had continued to burn them. Around 4:30 in the morning, the Shiano Maru approached the vessel, noting that she carried no guns and appeared to be an auxiliary ship. The Aurora, however, mistook the Shiano Maru for another Russian vessel and did not attempt to notify the Russian fleet. Instead, she signaled the ship to inform the Japanese ship that there were in fact other ships nearby. The Shiano Maru then sighted the shapes of 10 other Russian ships in the mist. The Russian fleet had been spotted, and any chance of reaching Vladivostok has now completely disappeared. You see, the Russians sailed halfway across the world to try and break this blockade on the port of Vladivostok. It was a very critical operation during the Russo-Japanese War, and failure was not an option for the Russians. The Russians sailed south-southwest to north-northeast, continuing to a point of intersection which allowed the Russians to only bring their bow guns to bear against the Japanese, which was a critical advantage for the Japanese. The Japanese fleet steamed from north-east to west. Togo ordered the fleet to turn in sequence, basically doing a U-turn type maneuver as they engaged, which enabled all of his ships to take the same course as the Russians, but only risking one battleship at a time. Togo's U-turn was successful, but the Russian gunnery was effective. The flagship Mikasa was hit 15 times in 5 minutes. Before the end of the engagement, she would be struck another 15 more times by large caliber shells. The Russians had only 2 alternatives at this point: a charge direct, line abreast, or to commence to a formal pitched battle. The Russians chose the latter. At 14:08, the Japanese flagship was hit at about 7,000 meters, with the Japanese replying at 6,400 meters. Superior Japanese gunnery then took its toll, with most of the Russian battleships being crippled. As naval engagements traditionally began at a considerably closer range, Togo immediately gained the advantage of surprise. Commander Vladimir Semenov, a Russian staff officer aboard the flagship Kiana Suvorov, noted that it seemed impossible to even count the number of projectiles striking us. Shells seemed to be pouring upon us insistently, one after another. The steel plates and superstructure on the upper decks were torn to pieces, and the splinters caused many casualties. Iron ladders were crumpled up into rings, guns were literally hurled from their mountings. In addition to this, there was the unusually high temperature and liquid flame of the explosions, which seemed to spread over everything. I actually watched a steel plate catch fire from a burst. An hour and a half into the fight, the first warship to be sunk in the battle was the Russian battleship Osilibiana. I don't know how to say these damn words. Prior to this sea battle, modern armored battleships had never been anything, or that had never been sunk by gunfire alone, and now the Oslibana had gained the unfortunate distinction of being history's first. To further add to that, the admiral of the Russian fleet was knocked out of action as he was struck by a shell fragment in the head. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, by the way. During the course of the battle throughout the day, 3 more battleships would join their sister ship on the bottom of the ocean. Once night hit, things did not get any better for the Russians. 21 destroyers and 37 Japanese torpedo boats were thrown against the Russian fleet. It was absolute chaos. The Russians were now dispersed into small groups to try and break northwards, and during the night there were actually several collisions that the Japanese had against the Russian ships. The night action took a very, very bad toll against the Russians. They lost 2 battleships and 2 armored cruisers, while the Japanese had only lost 3 torpedo boats. As the night battle drew to a close, Admiral Togo deployed his destroyers to hunt down any remaining warships and then consolidate his heavy units. At 9:30 in the morning, what remained of the Russian fleet was sighted heading northwards. Togo's battleships proceeded to surround the Russian fleet south of the island of Takashima and commenced main battery fire at 12,000 meters. Realizing that the guns were out of range by at least 1,000 yards and that he could be destroyed at Togo's leisure, Admiral Nebogatov ordered, I cannot pronounce these Russian names, Admiral Nebogatov ordered the 6 remaining ships under his command, that is 6, number 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 remaining ships under his command to surrender. XGE, an international sign of surrender, was hoisted. However, the Japanese Navy continued to fire, as they did not have surrender in their code books, and had to hastily find one that did. Still under heavy fire, the Russian admiral then ordered white tablecloths sent up the mastheads. But Admiral Togo, having had a Chinese-shaped warship escape him while flying that flag during the 1894 war, did not trust that white flag and continued to fire his main batteries. Togo's experience was reinforced when the Russian cruiser Izmirund quickly yanked down her XGE surrender flag and bolted. Running out of options, the Russians then finally ordered the Imperial Japanese Navy flag up the mastheads and all engines stopped. When the Japanese flags began showing up in their 12-inch guns rangefinders, Admiral Togo gave the order to cease fire and accepted the Russian surrender. The Russian admiral was unwilling to sacrifice the lives of his sailors simply to save his own honor. He decided instead to accept the shame of surrender, knowing full well that he might be shot when he returned to Russia. He said to his men, "You are young, and it is you who will one day retrieve the honor and glory of the Russian Navy. The lives of the 2,400 men in these ships are more important than mine." Neither Russian admirals involved in this incident were shot when they returned home to Russia. However, both were placed on trial. The first admiral claimed responsibility for the fiasco, but as he had been wounded and unconscious during the last part of the battle, the Tsar commuted his death sentence. The second admiral, having actually surrendered the fleet at the end of the naval engagement, was imprisoned for several years and eventually pardoned by the Tsar. Both men's reputations, however, were completely ruined. The battle was a devastating humiliation for Russia, which lost all of its battleships and most of its cruisers and destroyers. The battle effectively ended the Russo-Japanese War in Japan's favor. The Russians lost 4,380 men, and 5,917 were captured, including 2 admirals, with a further 1,862 interred. The Russians lost 11 battleships, including 3 smaller coastal vessels, either sunk or captured by the Japanese, or scuttled by their crews. 4 ships were lost to enemy action during the daylight battle. 4 other battleships under the second admiral were forced to surrender and would end up as prizes of war. The Russian Navy lost 4 of its 8 cruisers during the battle. 3 were interred by the Americans, and only just 1 reached Vladivostok. The Japanese lost only 3 torpedo boats, with 117 men killed and 500 wounded. Talk about a one-sided battle. But back to the Aurora, I really haven't mentioned much about her. She did survive that battle, and as I said, she was later returned to the Russia by the Americans. In 1906, she returned to the Baltic and became a cadet training ship. During World War I, the Aurora operated in the Baltic Sea, performing patrols and shore bombardment tasks. In 1915, she received her 152 millimeter guns that I'm just pouring into that South Carolina over there. At the end of 1916, she was moved from to St. Petersburg for a major repair. The city was brimming with revolutionary action, and part of her crew joined the 1917 February Revolution. A committee was created on her ship, and most of the crew joined the Bolsheviks, who were preparing for a communist revolution. At 9:45 p.m. on the 25th of October 1917, a blank shot from her forecastle gun signaled the start of the assault on the Winter Palace, which was the beginning of the October Revolution. In the summer of 1918, she was relocated and placed into reserve. In 1922, the Aurora returned to service as a training ship assigned to the Baltic Fleet. On the 2nd of November 1927, the Aurora was awarded the Order of the Red Banner for her revolutionary merits. During the Second World War, the guns were taken from the ship and used in the land defense of Leningrad. The ship herself was docked in a port and was repeatedly shelled and bombed. On the 30th of September 1941, she was damaged and sunken in the harbor. In 1944, the Aurora, despite her state, would become the first campus and training vessel in the Nakhimov Naval School. After extensive repairs from 1945 to 1947, the Aurora was permanently anchored in St. Petersburg as a monument to the Great October Socialist Revolution, and in 1957 she became a museum ship. On the 22nd of February 1968, she was awarded the Order of the October Revolution, a badge which portrays the Aurora herself. And that's all I have on the Aurora, ladies and gentlemen. I've been rambling about this ship for a long time, but she has a pretty extensive history, and we're quickly approaching the end of this battle here. Not a whole lot I can do. Pretty much fighting for my life down here against these pesky Tier 2 destroyers. I was hoping to try and deter most of these destroyers from coming up the west side of the map, and I did succeed for a moment until most of my team pretty much dissolved around me. Not really blaming my team, but, you know. You can't win them all. That's the moral of the story. Hopefully my team will be able to pull something out here. We got a destroyer in their cap, trying to cap for a win here, finishing off that cruiser that I managed to cripple earlier. South Carolina now exchanging fire with an enemy cruiser over there on the horizon. I can't quite see what it is from here. The view that I'm looking at is pretty grainy. It is taking fire, and the South Carolina reload rate on her guns is not too exceptional. But what do we have over here? We have an AFK Clemson. Is that a Clemson? I think it's a Clemson. That's great. So it's effectively 2-on-3 right now. We have a destroyer on a fraction of health. We have the South Carolina that has an enemy destroyer chasing him down. He needs to start turning the port here to try and get those guns to bear. What the hell is he looking at? I guess he's just trying to outrun the destroyer. That's not going to happen. Secondary guns opening up, firing with his main battery. Looks like he only scored one hit there. That's not going to be enough. This enemy destroyer closing rapidly. He's going to do something. No. No, turn the other way. Oh my god. That's a large spread of torpedoes. 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 torpedo hits. Oh, that's going to be a nice chunk of credits for that enemy player. That's great. Well, and it's now 1-on-3, and this destroyer is on a fraction of health. He's been detected by that Tenryu, which is easily going to outgun him here. Firing off a desperate spread of torpedoes against that Tenryu, but he's taking fire from that destroyer. Not a whole lot he's going to be able to do here. He's on a fraction of health, and up there he goes. So our hopes lie with an AFK Clemson. That's, oh, that's just great. Well, at least we won't have to wait long for the enemy to figure out where he is, as that freaking destroyer that sunk the South Carolina and then sunk our last remaining player that's actually at the keyboard, barrels in for the final kill here. He's going to do a little showboating. Pulling up alongside the ship, killing the engines, just checking to see if there's any lights on, and doesn't look like there is. Let's go ahead and put this little bastard out of his misery. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's game. That's another defeat. Unfortunately, not a very successful outing in the Aurora, but you can see, even in a defeat, 154,000 credits earned. Second on the team. Not too bad. Not too bad at all. Thank you guys for watching this video. Give it a like if you liked it. Comment down below if you got a comment or question for me. And as always, take care. I'll see you when I see you.